We have now reached the third part of our Advent series called Follow Your Dreams. And if you've been with us, you know we've been looking at this series called Follow Your Dreams, not in the typical rah-rah, you can do it, believe in yourself, and that kind of thing. But it's more, Follow Your Dreams refers to, in the opening two chapters of Matthew's Gospel, there are four occurrences when people receive a message from God through the form of a dream, this intuitive thing that's beyond rationality and written text. They receive this word from God, and actually they end up making changes. They go new directions because of the message that they've received. And so far we've talked about how Joseph was led to reconsider his decision to divorce Mary because of what the baby would mean for them. Last week we talked about the Magi and how they had to reroute themselves in order to head back home. Today we're going to be talking about relocating. Another instance of when Joseph receives a dream. This one, though, is a little different. The first one was very uplifting and positive. Joseph, the child Mary is carrying is Emmanuel, God with us. And he changes his course. This one's a little different because it's a little darker, a little more disturbing, and yet Joseph is willing and ready to listen and to relocate his family from their home, even from their homeland. We pick up the story right after the Magi have left in Matthew chapter 2. We'll be reading verses 13 through 18. When they had gone, the Magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. And then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more." So we see in this passage, this time the message Joseph receives in a dream is to relocate. Is to actually just get out. Just get out, right? So the opening question for us to think about this morning, just to get the gears turning, have you ever been in a situation where you just needed to get out? Right? I'm not going to ask you to answer out loud or even nudge the person next to you, right? Because it may have been a family reunion recently that you just realized I need to get out, right? Or maybe a blind date that you were set up on, many years ago, and you were halfway through and thought, "Yep, I just need to get out," right? I had one of these experiences just last night, actually similar to Mr. Incredible there. I was taking my daughter to her band concert, and for some reason, all the people with children for the band concert were lining up near the curb to drop them off, and the line of cars was starting to go all the way down the driveway, if you know Salem High School, almost to the road, and I felt like I was just absolutely trapped. And I thought to myself, my daughter's 13. She's perfectly capable of walking from a parking spot all the way into the building, and there are hundreds of parking spots over here with lines dedicated to show you where to park. So I veered out of that lane. I took the risk of oncoming traffic, but eventually I just needed to get out. I needed to get out. And maybe you've been in a situation where you just knew you needed to get out. And that's the situation Joseph and Mary and Jesus found themselves in. They needed to get out. Now, this isn't always the case with the life of Jesus. Matter of fact, I would argue that what we see here is the exception. Because typically, later in his life, Jesus, and sometimes along with his parents, would experience great suffering that would be absorbed instead of avoided. Through much of his life, Jesus looked suffering, struggle, and pain in the face, and instead of avoiding it, he absorbed it. Jesus, if you read the Gospels, is rejected. He's driven away. He's confronted by powerful religious leaders. He's accused of being demon-possessed. Ultimately, he faces the entirety of his passion narrative, and all of it was dangerous and painful and full of struggle. And in those moments, Jesus did not avoid but instead he absorbed. Sometimes standing your ground in the face of danger and struggle is what is called for. Matter of fact, you look at Jesus' life, you look at the books in the New Testament, right? Those were written to those earliest churches, and they are full of language that says, be strong, stand, things like that. So I would say that most of the time that is the encouragement. However, Jesus is also occasionally seen on the pages of Scripture avoiding conflict with his enemies and with those who would seek to do him harm. It's not often, but it is occasional that Jesus actually avoids the struggle, the danger, the suffering. I'll give you one really good concrete example, and I'm going to set it up before we go to it. Jesus is preaching, teaching in a synagogue, and it's near or in his hometown, and he starts saying, a prophet is without honor in his hometown. Then he kind of goes on to really lay into the gathered congregation, accusing them of being just like the people before them who really mistreated the prophets, and he starts talking about, on Judgment Day, it's going to be worse for you guys than Sodom and Gomorrah. Needless to say, that sermon did not go over well. And so we pick it up in Luke chapter 4, verse 28. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Sometimes you just have to get out. Sometimes the best and wisest option is to remove yourself, even if it's just temporarily, to seek a place of refuge. And that's exactly what Jesus and his family do in this situation. They get out to seek refuge, to live to stand another day. Now, it's probably true that in your lives, many or most of you are not in danger of being thrown off a cliff anytime soon, I wouldn't think. So how do we translate some of these ideas into our day-to-day lives when we talk about some things we maybe need to get out of? And I want to talk a bit about it this morning in this way. I want to talk about the idea of toxic people. Actually, I would like to talk about toxic relationships, because I think that the label toxic people is kind of a dangerous one. And this might be a brand new concept to you. Maybe it's not. But I think the label toxic people speaks of some form of beyond redemption than toxic relationships. Here's what I mean about that. There's a difference between guilt and shame, right? Guilt can actually be a very healthy thing. When you do something wrong, when you hurt someone else, you should feel guilt about what you've done, and that can actually drive you to seek forgiveness and to make things right. So in a sense, guilt can be, though it feels really negative at the time, it can be a positive thing. Shame is way different. Guilt is about the things I have done, the decisions I've made, the choices that I've made. Shame is about who I am. Guilt says you've done wrong things, bad things. Shame says you're a bad person. It's a fine line, but it's an important one. And I would rather us talk about toxic relationships instead of toxic people. I think we throw around that label toxic people because a lot of times it justifies what we want to do. But I would rather us talk about toxic relationships. When you label a person as toxic, you're saying that they are not capable of healthy relationships. And frankly, you don't know the entirety of their life. But to say that this is a toxic relationship for me with this person is absolutely a valid thing to consider when we talk about times and places where we need to get out. Toxic relationships are very, very real and very, very dangerous. And when you realize that you are in one, often the safest thing to do, again, even if it's just temporary, is to get out. These are situations where the hope of overcoming the threat or the danger or the suffering is tiny or non-existent, and the consequences might be catastrophic, like Jesus in Bethlehem. He had to get out. The chances of standing up to the power of Herod and the consequences would have been catastrophic. If Mary and Joseph would have stayed, Jesus may have died, and the hope that he brought would have died with him. Sometimes we just need to get out. And sometimes it's not just relationships. Sometimes our situations and our environments can be toxic. And if you are in one of those today, we'll circle back to this at the end, I want you to pray about what it might look like to get out. Because here's the thing, if God incarnate had moments when he needed to just get out, when he decided the wisest thing would be to step aside and step away. Why can't you? I mean, you're strong, but are you stronger than Jesus? I would beg to differ. If we see in Jesus' life that at least on occasion, he believes and acts in ways that say the wisest thing to do is to get out, seek refuge, and live to stand another day, then why can't we? Of course, the question then becomes, well, how do we know? How do you know when to stand and when to get out, when to walk away? And I would love to share with you this morning the formula that I've designed for this. But there is not one, so I can't do that. And it's about discernment. It's about listening to the voice of God. You know, God speaks in dreams in these situations, those intuitive ways that you sort of feel God is speaking something to you. A lot of times you can take those feelings to a community of people and say, what do you think about this? But I think it's important to seek discernment if we face relationships, environments, circumstances that might be toxic and therefore deeply threatening to our lives, to our personhood, to what we're trying to do. I also think we can take a look at Herod to get an idea, because this situation teaches us about a situation in which Jesus got out. So we're going to talk in a moment about how honestly terrible Herod was. But we're talking about some heavy stuff this morning between toxic relationships, and we're going to get to this, what happens with Herod. So I felt like we needed something a little lighter to sort of balance that out. So we're going to talk in a moment about Herod's temper, and man, does he have a temper. So I got to thinking about tempers and if there are humorous ways to talk about tempers, and then it hit me. We are less than 2 months removed from Halloween. And every Halloween, there's a late night host named Jimmy Kimmel. And he does this thing where he encourages parents to video them telling their kids the morning after Halloween that they ate all their Halloween candy the night before. And so they record these responses from the children and then send them into the show, and he cobbles them together and shows them later. You've probably heard the saying about, there's no scorn, like there's no fury like a woman scorned. I don't know. You take all the Halloween candy from a child the morning after, and it's pretty close. So I just took a few of them and pushed them together, just like 2 minutes, but just to get us thinking about what tempers might look like, check out these highlights.
In this year's edition of Hey Jimmy Kimmel, I told my kids I ate all their Halloween candy.
You ate all of your Halloween candy. We're sorry. Is it okay?
No! Not at all!
Well, guess what?
Guess what?
We're just joking.
Mama was just too hungry.
I ate all your candy. I'm gonna call the police.
Mommy and Daddy ate all of your Halloween candy. Is that okay?
We ate all of your candy. Will you forgive me?
Yes, but don't do it again. It will make your belly sick. I'm counting on you, Willie.
Juliana.
That's so rude of you. Tomorrow I'm going to eat your stuff. For real. And I'm not going to eat you no goodies. Just puppy. That's so rude of you.
I'm really hungry.
Well, you gotta eat some vegetables, not candy. Go, now! Go! Eat some vegetables. See? You make us upset. Say sorry.
Last night, I got hungry and I ate all of your Halloween candy.
Mackenzie, Jimmy Kimmel told me to do it.
No, thank you.
Jimmy Kimmel told me to trick you.
Who's that? It's Jimmy Pickle. Don't get mad at Mom. It's just Jimmy Pickle. That's true stuff.
Don't be mad at Mom. It's just Jimmy Pickles' fault. So tempers in young children, when they're tricked, humorous, laugh. But what we see here is the temper of not only a grown man, but a very powerful man. And so when he has a temper, he can do incredibly damaging things, right? We see that Herod, we're told, is furious when he realizes the Magi are not coming back to report the findings like he requested of them. And his response is that he sends out a message that all of the young boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity need to be killed. It's called the Massacre of the Innocents in history. This is a man whose power is without restraint, and it's also a man for whom this would not have been all that surprising because of his character. Just a few examples from history that I found in a resource this week. There was at one point in time a young but popular competitor for Herod, a high priest at the time. That high priest happened to have a drowning accident in a pool that was only a couple feet deep. Herod at one point in time was enraged at his favorite wife, and so he had her strangled. He was deceived into having 2 innocent sons executed. On his deathbed, he had another son executed, at least that one was guilty of something. And even though it's probably more folklore than reality, I think it's accurate, the saying that went with Herod at the time, that it was safer to be one of Herod's pigs than his sons, because you would probably live longer. And then the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Herod gave an order that upon his death, they were to also execute multiple nobles so that there would be the proper amount of mourning that would happen along with his death. Now, thankfully, they did not, after he died, they did not follow up on that command and they set those nobles free, right? So this is the kind of person, the kind of character that we're dealing with. And to give you an accurate as possible picture of what happened at Bethlehem, it was a relatively small village at the time. It only has a population of about 25,000 today, but scholars believe in Jesus' day that it was between 300 and 900 people who lived there. So the number of children fitting that age range of Jesus was not hundreds or thousands, but it certainly was dozens. But really that begs the question, isn't one child's life too many to be taken for such a purpose? And I found myself wondering as I read through these things during the week, asking this question: have we, over 2,000 years of advances in just about every area of society, have we learned to treat our children any better? Or are we still willing to ignore them, cast them aside, do what needs to be done? Probably the most glaring example, I think we've come a little bit, but I think we have a lot of room yet to grow. The most glaring example would be the statistics on abortion that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I was born in 1989. I wish I was born in 1989 sometimes. I was born in 1979, and that same year, there were about 1.5 million abortions here in the United States. And it's easy to hear those numbers and use them as sort of weapons of shame and judgment for the people who made those decisions. But I feel grief more than anything, because I know that the women who made those choices, most of them felt stuck without any options and already deal with enough grief on their own that they don't need to have it piled upon them. But it is a deep grief to realize that I maybe had, classmates or friends that I never would have had because of it. Now, the good news is that by 2017, the most recent statistics I could find, there were only 862,000, a 43% drop in the rate of abortions in our country. Fewer and fewer women over the last 40 years have felt trapped and are receiving hope and encouragement and education and empowerment from places like the Sophia Women's Center that we have right here in Salem, and the tremendous ministry that they do. But that's not the only place, right? You can find evidence and statistics other places about the fact that we have a long way to go to fully appreciate children in the way that I think Jesus would have us appreciate them. There are overwhelming numbers of children today that are still abused, that are neglected, that are abandoned. According to statistics, there are about 2.5 million homeless children just in this country, not globally, 2.5 million homeless children, and about a little over 16 million children in this country don't have enough adequate food to have the daily resources they need in order to thrive as kids. And it's not just us. There are global repercussions that are happening here, right? You've heard stories about refugees. I remember listening to stories about Jason Smith talking about refugees that would brave the Mediterranean to arrive in Italy just for a chance for their families to have a chance because of what they were trying to escape. And you've heard stories about refugee kids who are trying to escape gang violence, right? And coming out of South America. And the question is, are we willing to see those children and act differently today? Have we learned? Have we grown enough that we are willing to care for children in the way that God intends for us to care for children? I think maybe a big part of the Christmas message, at least for me this season and studying this week, is this. God didn't just become a man, God became a child. Jesus did not descend to us in a fully mature human man form. Jesus didn't even come to us as an awkward teenage boy, right? Who was able to give and do and be responsible. Jesus, when he arrived as a baby. What does that say about the value God places on children, that Jesus didn't just come as a man, but as a child? It shouldn't surprise us at all that Jesus later in his ministry welcomed the children and even said to his followers, unless you can come to me like a child, then the kingdom of heaven may not be a great fit for you. Are we willing to care for children as Jesus would have us care for children? So because Joseph was willing to care for his child, even though it meant leaving home, leaving his homeland, traveling a really, really long way, they did so. They left by night, which speaks to the imminence, and they traveled to Egypt. Now, if you're a student of Scripture, when you see travel to Egypt, these alarms should start going off. Something significant is being told to us as the readers when you get Jewish people involved in Egypt. And so I want to pivot. The last point I want to make this morning is less a practical one and more of a theological one, because this is just the beginning in Matthew's gospel of how we're invited to see Jesus as the new and better Moses. You see it throughout Matthew's gospel. And this is just the beginning. You know, the fulfillment of the prophecy, I called my son out of Egypt. We are, as readers of Matthew's gospel, to see Jesus as the new and better Moses. And remember this, Matthew's gospel, if you're not familiar, was written to a Jewish audience. It was written to Jewish people. So one of the purposes of Matthew's gospel was to show these Jewish people that the man they revered and loved so deeply, Moses, that there was now a new and better Moses. And his name is Jesus. There are several examples of how we're supposed to make this transition. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, right? Jesus on a mountainside doing some teaching about the way to live. Does that sound familiar at all? Of course it should. Moses received the law on the mountain, came down, and taught the people how to live. Jesus is a new and better Moses. And then in Matthew chapter 17, the Mount of Transfiguration, right? The disciples, a few of them are there with Jesus, and all of a sudden he transforms, right? And then it's this sort of cloud-like environment, which reckons back to Sinai again. And then who appears with Jesus? But Elijah and Moses, the lawgiver. And Peter is so pumped. He is so excited. Peter's like, oh, Jesus, I have such a great idea. Listen. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to build 3 shelters, right? One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Inherently meaning we're going to listen to all of these voices. And then there's this voice from heaven that says what? This is my son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And when the disciples look again, who's the only person left standing? It's only Jesus. People for whose generations had listened to the words of Moses are now being shepherded to the voice of Jesus. Jesus is a new and better Moses. Hebrews 3 even makes it a clear declaration. Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses. Moses was faithful as a servant in God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is the faithful Son over God's house. The new and better Moses arrives in the person of Jesus. So what does it all mean? There's a lot that goes into it, but I want to land here. Jesus is the culmination of the story of Israel, but it's a culmination that will turn the world upside down. And that shouldn't surprise us. The first Exodus turned the world upside down. Enslaved people left the most powerful nation on earth and took their gold with them. The world turned upside down. Jesus, being the new Moses, is about to again turn the world upside down. And people like Herod like the world just as it is. And so sometimes it's necessary to stand. Sometimes it's necessary to relocate, to get out, to grow, to stand another day. We don't know much about the childhood of Jesus, but we do have one snapshot, that scene where he goes to Jerusalem, the worship in the temple. They get on their way home, and everybody's like, oh, we forgot Jesus, right? So they go back, and where do Mary and Joseph find him as a child? In the temple, discussing things with the elders and the scholars, and they are amazed by him. And we're told right along with that story in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, very simply this: Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. In wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Now, I'm not going to ask you if you're still growing in stature today, because all of our kids, I think, have left, and they should still be. I find that in my life these days, the only way I'm growing in stature is actually horizontally, and I don't know that that's actually a great thing. But the question remains, are you growing in wisdom and in favor with God and man? Because Jesus, after he survived that massacre of the innocents, and next week we'll talk about the journey back from Egypt, but Jesus grew. And I believe that because Mary and Joseph followed that leading to get out, this growth of Jesus would have never happened. Sometimes we get out so we can grow more, so that then we are ready to take the stand that we need to take. Jesus is going to take many, many stands later in his life. But because they got out, took refuge, and he was able to grow. He was able to do the things later in life that he did. So a few things to think about as we finish our time together, a few reflections for us to sort of zero in on, not only today, but they're in the bulletin insert, so if you want to take them this week and continue to pore over them, here's the first one. Are you in a toxic relationship or a toxic situation right now that you know is dangerous for you? If so, ask God to show you the wisest way to get out, to seek safety, to find refuge somewhere else. Secondly, do you know a child who is being abused or neglected or mistreated or ignored? And then the question is, if so, how can you reach out to that child during this Christmas season? How can we celebrate the birth of Jesus by remembering the children around us who maybe desperately need to be loved? Third, take a moment this morning to pray for the women who will be encouraged by and supported by the Sophia Women's Center in Salem here to choose life in 2020. A tremendous ministry, and we need to pray for them. And then lastly, are you following the example of Jesus, growing in wisdom and in favor with God and man, so that those times when you do need to get out, you are therefore then being strengthened to be able to take a stand later on. So take a few minutes to close your eyes if you would like, bow your head if you would like to do that, or simply read through those words on the screen. We'll allow for a moment for the Holy Spirit to speak to each of us individually, and then I will close that time with a word of prayer.